to it. There's then narrow play, and narrow play is when the point is threatening to the opponent, and it also is when the weapons are close to one another. So when a parry happens that arrests the weapon in front, narrow play is much more this kind of action. So it's defending, changing position against the weapon, thrusting, moving to the other side, thrusting, yielding, but returning. So you notice it's much tighter. And it is here also where we might enter to control the opponent's weapon, where we could even move from narrow play into wrestling play, even in unarmed situations, to fight close and shorten the webs. That's narrow play. So that's a little bit of the, you can see that, and you notice when I'm doing narrow play, the footwork changes, much shorter, advancing, retreating type steps. Whereas in the wide play,
yes, I see.
Much larger, gathering, re-entering. And also you see the size of the actions from the driven from the shoulders, the body is turning. So there's a lot more of this opening the chest, body, big turns, narrow play, much shorter, much tighter, more play in this space. So that's the kind of wide play, narrow play of the two-handed sword.
Perfect.
Then I'll grab another sword. This is an arming sword, but in the Italian tradition, this is the spada di lato, okay, or the side sword. And it's essentially a simple hilted rapier, an early rapier, often used with the buckler. And it has also wide and narrow play. And particularly with the buckler, you have more wide play. Because I have the defense of this tool here in my hand, I can move with more impunity through this space and not have to worry about keeping the weapon in front of me to defend. Whereas when I'm fighting with sword alone, more narrow play. I need to keep the threat of the point in front of me. So even when I make a defense, I want to defend in a way that's always threatening and keeps the proximity, but also to cut. But in an unarmored situation, whereas I have a lot more flexibility here, I can clear through this space. Because of course, if I'm deceived by the opponent, I have a second line of defense here. So I have more security. And so this is again with sword and buckler. And all of these arts, I'm going to sort of switch gears in a moment. We tend to hold ourselves fairly upright and a little bit forward. We are structured in a way to support rotational movement, okay, large opening of the chest. And then even when I start to play more narrow, I'm still staying, because I'm in it with both longsword and with the sword and buckler, I'm always ready to move into these rotational attitudes. Whereas when we get to weapons like the rapier and even the spear, suddenly there's a change in the body postures, both in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which is more narrowed. So even though I was fighting with a spear, when we get into the true like unarmored spear fighting, it's narrow profiled. Armored spear fighting, square. Because armored spear fighting, we're doing a lot more rotational work. Whereas when we're doing point-oriented work, the body becomes oriented behind the point of the sword. And so in the rapier, we can see it's much more, the rapier is all about gioco stretto. So the same kind of attitudes, actions are there, the same shorter footwork, but the weapon is staying always point on line. And I'm now, as we're getting to more of a dueling tradition and less of a battlefield self-defense tradition, there's more of a scientific approach to it. So I'm limiting targets. Instead of standing here, all of this is a target. I'm pulling my head away, taking my chest away, taking my leg away as a target. So it's easier to bring it away. If I have the weapon forward, I'm taking my lower body away, hiding my body behind the hilt of the sword. Again, it's a duel. I know who my one opponent is. I know they're trying to strike me with a thrust. Whereas in the earlier things, I might be fighting multiple people. So cuts are very useful when there's multiple opponents. I need to be more rotationally oriented. So the posture supports rotational movement. Back to the duel, the posture is supporting linear movement, linear defense, even though we do, of course, step offline, but it's all serving primary action of the thrust of the sword.
Beautiful. Yes.
And one last thing, I suppose, is because people always want to know is in Europe, as we get into the dueling traditions, the buckler starts to lose its vogue and is replaced by the dagger. And part of that is there's a little bit of commentary. One master says, the problem with a buckler is that when it's struck by a thrust, the thrust is likely to glance off and hit you somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so the dagger has the benefit of being able to control like a sword. And of course, it's also a weapon, but it's very much something of the dueling time. And with the dueling rapier, they're always within, actually most of the European traditions, they're used always in unison with one another. So they're always making joint covers. So I'm protecting high with the sword and low with the dagger, or high with the dagger and low with the sword, so that my tactical options are narrowed. So I don't have, I think we see it in like movies and bad HEMA fighting, people trying to kind of have two fights with the rapier and sword working independently from one another. And you know as I do that human brains are not very good at multitasking. And so we want to, within these traditions, certainly how I teach now and how it was done historically, we want to be thinking more about creating unified shapes. So I'm actually making single patterns where the weapons are always working together. So if I'm defending my head with the dagger, the sword is always following it. I'm defending my leg with the sword, the dagger is always following. And I'm attacking you, the dagger is always following. They're just making these shapes. And that way it's much simpler for my brain. And by using them always together to protect one side or the other, I'm always creating a circumstance where the opponent only has one place they can go to. So from here, if they're trapped to my right, they have to come to my left, and one movement protects me against all of the options. So that unified system, that really starts to become clearer and clearer within the Italian tradition as we develop into the Renaissance. So there's a little crash course on a few different weapons and the mechanics and how they work.
Yes. And what is the sword back there? There is another sword.
So this is it looks kind of funny.
Yes.
So this is a longer handled longsword. This kind of fits, the handle length is more like a two-handed sword or a bastard sword. And it has this very narrowed place here. And this is, it's funny, when I had first seen these, I actually first saw some reproductions of them and I thought, that's a really silly modern idea. But then I saw them in museums. And it is, nowadays they sometimes call them feather swords, Federschwert, from the German. And it is a way of making a practice sword. And these were used historically both for practice as well as for friendly sparring or competitive sparring. And that way you can keep a similar weight to the true two-handed sword, but have the weapon blade be quite light so you can strike more safely with it. And even, be quite flexible and take the weight that would normally be in the weapon and put it down here in this part called the schild. And this is there to protect the hand so that when a weapon collects down into the cross, it puts more space between the hand and the crossbar. So it makes you a little bit safer in those defenses. And this is a long sword in every way. But of course, you see longer handles. So that means a little bit more rotational power. And these are, there's various versions of these used now for tournament fencing and for light sparring. And then historically, they were also used for that for practice, but also in a lot of essentially like fraternal dueling orders and organizations that had sparring events. And they were often used in a very specific kind of sporting form of longsword, particularly in the 1500s.
And very good. Could you please tell us, do you also teach single dagger?
Yes, yeah. So I don't have a rondelle dagger here, but these daggers were used also alone. But the knightly dagger, called the rondelle, tended to have like a triangular blade or a square blade to make the blade more rigid so it could pierce armor. And they were called rondelles, which means round, because their hilt was a simple round disc. And so we do teach dagger alone. And it's interesting, a lot of the techniques are in a reversed grip versus being in a forward grip. There are forward grip techniques as well. There's a little bit of historical commentary on this within the tradition that this is the knightly way to hold a dagger. And this is the way that like a ruffian holds a dagger. And it's funny because we often think, I think nowadays we often think the opposite. People often think of this as kind of like a thuggish way to hold the dagger. And this is like a military style of holding a dagger. And you know, if you think about the dagger as a tool for fighting in armor, this gives you the mass that you need to do piercing into the weak places in armor. And this position is not as useful against somebody who's wearing a suit of armor. And so this is how a thug who's trying to beat you up behind the bar is holding their knife, because it's unarmored fighting. And whereas a knight is training to hold a dagger this way, because they're not fighting unarmored people, they're fighting other knights. So that's what makes this a knightly fashion of holding the dagger. And in that, the interesting thing I love about the medieval knife tradition too, is that it's kind of, to me, it reminds me, it's much more like a short stick tradition to me than it is. Often we think of knives now, a lot of traditions have little cuts, like when I was doing Filipino martial arts, a lot of little cutting with the knife. That tradition, again, it's a square or triangular tool. It's made for puncturing. So it's actually also even held this way and used to defend and strike, just like with the half swording. So you're getting this extra leverage. You're using it, again, like a short stick often. But there's a big part of the wrestling tradition is actually explored through the knife. And so we're using the knife to strike and counter, but we're also doing defenses against the knife. So almost all of the arm locks and everything traditionally, and I still teach them now often, you know, a lot of arm locks and wrist locks and things in a self-defense situation are quite difficult to achieve. And whereas when there's a weapon involved, they actually become easier to achieve. Not easy, easier, because of the length of the opponent's arm is extended. And so when someone makes a concerted effort to actually hit you with their weapon, then you suddenly find places to be able to bind the arm into various holds. And again, that extend their desire to not let go of their weapon often increases your capacity to put them into arm locks. Whereas if you're just fighting in a boxing situation, being able to put somebody into an arm lock in a boxing situation is super tough. And as we know, even in like UFC or whatever, locks and things don't tend to happen until you're in a protracted ground fighting situation. And when we're thinking self-defense encounter, especially group self-defense encounter, protracted on the ground is not something you want.
Yeah, of course. Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, we also see, I mean, talking now about UFC, we see a reverse is happening. Now everyone knows wrestling and everyone knows BJJ. Right. Now striking is much more important than it used to. It's just everything reversed now, right?
Yes.
Those days are gone, right? Exactly.
Totally.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, and I love, that's, to me, that's a really interesting thing. I've seen it in historical European martial arts as well. And it happens very specifically within these narrow confines. When we are confining things to this particular tournament environment, then of course there's this kind of, you know, one set of techniques comes to the fore and then it starts to get countered by a different set, and so everybody switches, but then that original set of techniques suddenly becomes ascendant again because everybody's kind of forgotten them and left them to the past. And so it's kind of cool to see that evolution, because you've created this little microcosm of martial art development.
Yeah. I'm not going to, I mean, I'm sure everyone knows that, but okay. I mean, because I don't want to mention his name, but it's for some reasons, right? But I think just for one thing, which confirms what we said, when Masvidal, you know, knocked out his opponent, who was an accomplished wrestler with a knee to his face when he went for double leg takedown. And it's not the only thing. We keep seeing it again and again. that the nature of UFC or MMA changed again to striking, because everyone
Yes.
knows how to counter. Everyone knows, you know, in the
Yeah.
past, I remember strikers came and they had no idea, right, what they should
I
do.
remember watching UFC 1 and 2, and just especially UFC 2, and watching all of those strikers just getting wrapped up and just having just no clue. Yeah.
And now those days are gone. Now striking is again important, much, you know, and then because everyone knows how to counter wrestling, counter BJJ. They every time they hit the ground, they always want to get up. So everything changed. Those days are gone, right? It's very interesting to watch that. And another thing I would like to ask you about pole arms. What kind of pole? Because I know that you teach them as well. What kind of pole arms do you teach, Devon?
So we teach the European pole arm tradition is super rich. You know, if you go into a museum now, any European museum, what do they have the most varied set of is pole arms. And so, you know, there's probably, you know, I think in a couple of my museum books I have, you know, it's probably over like 120 classified styles of pole arms. But they all tend to be, you know, a pole with some sort of metal contraption on the end. And that metal contraption is either oriented towards thrusting, so some sort of spear or sword blade. It's oriented towards cutting, so some sort of axe blade. It's oriented towards hooking, so there are many different hooking type tools, or it's oriented towards concussing, so a hammer type tool. And there's some actually that are also oriented towards piercing on the side, like a pick that could be used for piercing into armor from the side. And so all of those tools are part of that repertoire, and they have lots of cool, you know, in Italy they have lots of cool names. They're Partisano and Lanza and Ronca, and you know, there's all these just neat different names for all these things. And so, but they tend to, I think if you think about those ideas, you need to, within the polearm tradition, you need to learn how to thrust with the weapon. So using it to thrust and protect against thrusts. You need to learn how to deliver blows, and you're delivering blows with both the fore end as well as the back end of the weapon. You need to learn how to hook. So the weapon is used to hook and pull as a wrestling tool. And then within its defensive repertoire, you're using the end to defend, you're using between the hands to defend, and you're using the near side, which we call the pedal, like a pedal of a bike, the pedal on this side to defend. And it's a very versatile weapon where I feel like polearms, you know, when you and I collaborated on our workshop, I felt like in the polearm area, there was probably even more similarities than in the other areas.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, and I think it's probably the shared context is much higher, often where polearms are being employed. And you know, and just like in your tradition, in the European tradition, polearms are off, you know, there's kind of two sides to things. There is a set of polearms techniques which are all about being used at distance. So like the spear, and this is often both, there's techniques historically shown and that we teach that are both for, you know, working with a bunch of other people who have spears beside you, but also even what do I do if I'm alone with a spear? And that's all about distance. So using that weapon, and even a staff, and staffs are used often for striking with the end just as much as they're used for striking blows with the side. And so in those traditions, we're holding the weapon down at one end. But then there's a whole set of techniques which are all based around holding the weapon in the middle. And when we're holding it in the middle, it often ends up being a much closer quarters weapon as well. So we're changing between using it long and then using it to enter in close. And I remember when we were going through some of our techniques, both of us entered into grappling situations a certain amount of time too, even with a weapon that you think, oh, this isn't a grappling weapon. But you know, when you're dealing with somebody else who's got something long, one of the ways you can counteract that is to get in a lot closer. And within the European polearm tradition, you know, having this long piece of stick there, this long piece of wood, is also a great covering tool. It also protects you very broadly. It gives you a lot of cover, and with a lot of cover, you can enter. So that's, you know, and so the tradition also, and what we teach in our school, is both unarmored polearm, so fighting, you know, as a peasant would, as well as armored polearms. And that again changes those techniques. Unarmored tend to not have as much penchant to close, except when it's needed. Armored, there's a lot more entering with the polearm.
And you teach also archery, if I remember it correctly. Yeah. Could you explain, because many archers watch our channel, what kind of archery do you teach, please?
So we teach in our school. We teach both target archery. So it's really we're teaching a lot of we're teaching, I'd say, modern classical archery, which has a lot of, we certainly connected with the historical tradition of archery, and we teach with our basic bows that we start with our modern recurve takedown bows, but we don't use any modern. We don't use sights or laser sights or anything like that. And so it is traditional bare bow. We do long bow, we do flat bow as well, and then we also teach horseback archery. So we work with Kasai Archery, so you probably are familiar with them. And Robert Borsos is in our area, and so he comes and teaches, and we also have teachers of horseback archery. And so that is the Turkish horseback archery system. And so that is holding, I say the main difference there, when we're doing our classical archery, we're using a quiver or a ground quiver for the arrows, whereas in the horseback archery, you're holding the arrows in the hand of the bow so that you can easily bring the arrows are just if you've tried this yourself, I imagine you might have, quivers are terrible from horseback, because you want to have the arrows to be more affixed and easier to get. It's actually a lot easier to have the arrows already in hand, or to have some other system, but we use the in-hand system for our drawing.
Okay, and